Hello, everyone. This is Jimmy Beach. Welcome to this exposure demonstration today. This webinar is going to go through the entire process of editing with exposure. So by the end, you'll have a clear understanding of how exposure operates. I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction here before we can begin the lesson. First is that exposure is our advanced non-destructive raw photo organizer and editor. It handles a full post-processing workflow from copying images from camera cards, applying adjustments, creative effects, and even exporting your finished photos or printing from within exposure. Now, I'm not going to be printing from within exposure today, but we're going to touch on just about everything else I mentioned right there. So a quick history lesson is that, where's my mouse? Here it is. Quick history lesson about exposure is about 15 years ago. Exposure was developed for film photographers. Sorry, I'm typing and talking at the same time. It doesn't work. My apologies. Yeah, so it was developed for film photographers. Most of them struggle with the transition from working with analog film to working with digital cameras. You know, analog film, you had to use chemicals when you were in the dark room and all of that. Whereas when you use a digital camera, everything's digital. So yeah, took a little bit of, there was a few struggles there for anybody that used to be a fan or that still shoots on film. You'll know what I mean. So anyway, getting back to it, Exposure's accurate film emulation presets were really just what those photographers needed to make that transition. And so that's really where Exposure began, long days before any Instagram filters or anything like that. We were doing film emulations. And so before we get into the demonstration, we're about ready to, I want to point out that there is going to be time at the end reserved for answering any questions that you have specific to workflow, but you can type them into the chat or into the Q&A. And if I can, during the demonstration, I will make sure and answer those. So feel free to pipe up. And yeah, so let's get going. Okay, cool. That was me just making sure that we have Nate with us from the team. So he's going to be fielding any questions if you have anything specific that you want to ask. And yeah, he does our tech support. So he's super awesome about answering technical questions. So we are totally prepared for this. It's going to be so good. Okay, so I'm right here within Exposure. Now, typically when you start working with images in Exposure, you're going to be getting them from your camera card. So that's really where we're going to begin the process today, is getting images off of a camera card. And so when you plug a camera card into your computer, Exposure will bring up this dialog right here. It's set up to do that automatically, so it will pop up. And if you don't prefer that, you can turn that off in the preferences. But this is how it comes up. On the, we have some numbers here across the top, so we'll take a look at those. Step 1, this is where you tell it where to look for the photos. Step 2 are the photos themselves. That's where you look at the photos and and then you click or select which ones you want to copy. And over here, step 3, this is where you save them to. This is the destination where you're saving them on your computer. So we can have multiple cards here. If we were going to say we went on a vacation or something, we had a bunch of images from multiple cards, or we were on a shoot, shot a wedding, you have 5 or 6 cards. You can plug them all in at once and download them all at the same time. If you know, to speed up your workflow. So I've selected my camera card over here. Now we can see all in the middle where we can select and review the images that we want to copy. Now there are a bunch of different images from different photographers on this camera card. I'm doing this for a demonstration so that we can show you, some of the options that you have inside of this window. So we can select each image if we want to include or exclude. We can also do the same thing with the whole folder here. And we can collapse our different folders. So if there's a bunch of different shoots, or I think every shoot, no, they're not going to be numbered. So they'll all be in the same folder, but you can organize them. There we go. So I don't want to copy those. Turn those off. Not going to copy those from Jason. Turn those off. And here we have a selection from John Barclay. I'm going to leave those on. So we have 30 raw files from him. Now, Over on the right, this is where we're telling it where we want to copy our images to. And so I have it set up right now. Standard destination would be to our desktop. But I like to put all of my photos inside of a photos folder. So that's what I have right here. It says other folder. So I have it set up. So on my desktop, there's a photos folder. And then inside of that, I'm going to be saving a John Barclay folder with all of these images I have selected. So I'm just talking you through what I have set up here. There's some other options where you can make backups or convert to DNG. You can also rename the files if you want to as you're copying them. And you can also apply metadata to those files as you copy them. Now, most of the time you can set this up inside of your camera. So a lot of this stuff has already been put into there, but you can make your own preset here in exposure if you wanted to. Here's one from Alejandro that will apply some information. See, just like that. As you copy your images over. You can also add images that you're copying over to collections to organize them immediately as they're being copied. You can add keywords as well. And you can even put your favorite exposure preset on to the images as they are copied to your computer. So there's just a couple of options that you have there in terms of metadata and file handling. So I'm going to click OK, and then it's going to start the copy process. Now, it usually goes it was really quick. And so fast that I can't show you that as it's copying, you can do other work inside of exposure. I can copy a bunch of images all at once, and then we can watch the progress bar slowly, move more slowly. But it is pretty quick. I'm using a USB 3.0 camera card reader, or yeah, I think it's called a reader. So just in case anybody wanted to know. Okay, so we have our images here. So now that we've copied them to our computer, it's really easy. Now we're going to be doing our organizing, and this is a really important part of your workflow. Now, before I start just going and editing and organizing my images, I want to make out a very important point about exposure and about exposure's workflow, and that is that inside of exposure, there's not a catalog, and so what we see in exposure is the exact same. You can see my Finder window here. What we see in exposure is the exact same as what we see here on my hard drive. So what I have here is on my desktop. You can see my photos folder. And inside of there, we were just looking, there's John Barclay. So in the John Barclay folder, there are all the images that we see right here behind it in exposure. And they're all right here. And then you see a folder here with sidecar files. So that's the point that I wanted to make. Sidecars are where all of the edits that you make and the organizing things that you apply to your images, or the things that you apply to your images to organize them, are saved. It's not saved within a catalog. So, you don't have your catalog ever going bad or corrupt or anything like that, and you lose all your shots or all your edits. These ones are saved right here within this folder of images. So when you go to make a backup or copy your folder to an archive drive or something like that, excuse me, you can click a hold of the whole folder just like that, and then drag it over and, save it. When we go to iCloud, we can do it like that. And then it includes all of your editing adjustments, all of your organization and metadata, and all the stuff that you've applied to the images will go along with them. So it's a real simple process where you don't have to rethink where your photos are saved every time. So that's kind of handy. Another thing is that there's not a module inside of exposure. There's no modules. So all of the tools that you want to get to in exposure are available all the time. You don't have to do organizing and then go to a different module and do editing, or vice versa. So here we are. We're talking about organizing. Now, we did talk about how our folder structure is the same as it is on our computer hard drive. So I can literally click through these different images to see these are different folders of images that I have on my hard drive. So let's take a peek at images. And so here are some from Hiram. And I'm going to talk about how we're going to organize these, okay? And so the organizing tools inside of Exposure are very simple and they're very effective. You use flags, star ratings, and color labels. Those are three different things that you can use at your leisure to mark your different images for different uses. So pick and reject flag. That's usually the first place that people begin when they are saying whether they're going to keep the images or not. Like, let's say the first pass when you're doing an edit or not edit, a call. So that would be, I can click on the images that open themselves down here in the lower right-hand corner. I said right, but I really meant left-hand corner. So you can click on it there and see that it marked as a pick flag. Now it's white. You can see the border around it. That means I chose that one as a pick. If I wanted to reject it, I can click pick flag again. It'll mark it as a reject flag. If I click the reject flag again, whoop, goes right back to normal. Now you can use your keyboard shortcuts here to speed you up, and that would be, you can use the arrow keys to navigate around, and then use plus and minus on the keyboard to say if you want to keep the image or if you don't want to keep the image. Okay. Now I'm going through this really quickly, and they're at a small size because there are some repetitive looks here. And so that's kind of what I'm doing as I go through here. I'm looking at, oh, do I want to keep that shot? Like these two are similar, and this one looks a little bit more dynamic to me off of the cuff. So I would go with this one versus that one. So I would just mark this one as the no, and this one is the yes, or minus and plus. Okay. So it's pretty quick to move around doing that. You can also hold down the shift button when you're using your arrow keys and whatnot. So if you hold down shift and you select your rating, your pick flag, pick or reject flag. So I'm gonna hold down shift and do it. I'm gonna hit plus on that one. And you can see that it automatically advances me to the next image here. So that's pretty easy to do and quick. Also, these are just pick flags that I've been pointing out here. So we can also do color labels and star ratings, and they're the same way. You can do the same thing with those. So let's go back up here. So here's the one that we have here at the top. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger just so that I can see a little more of it. Okay. Then I can give it a rating. So we see the stars here on the bottom of our images. I can click which one I want to apply to that image. How much, a 4, if I think it's a 4-star image, great, I'll put 4. You can also use the keyboard. So I can click on my image here and I can give that a 5 rating. Keyboard again. I'll skip that one because I don't need to give that one a rating. It has a reject flag. And this one I can say that one's a 4. And this one, let's say, is 5. Okay. So I've applied a couple of star ratings to these images. I hope you guys see where I'm going with this. And that is, yes, if I want to, I can select a bunch of images and give them a rating, or I can use the shift button just like I was with the pick and reject flag, the plus and minus keys, and use the numbers 1 through 5 on my keyboard. So I'm going to hold shift here and push 4. Automatically advances to the next one. This one's a little bit brighter, so I'll give it a 5. And that one, 3. See where I'm going? That is a very quick way of getting through images fast, especially when you are going through your passes, trying to make things work really quickly. So a lot of the times when you're making your way through images, especially when you have some repeating images or when you have images that are similar, especially for like wedding photography, which I did for a number of years, man, you have so many images that look very similar. And sometimes it's really difficult to go through there and make those, or make that decision because they're so close and you want to keep as many as you can, of course. So getting through this quickly is a really good way of making sure that you stay, you make progress instead of getting stuck. I find that when you're editing an enormous amount of images, and I mean like in the thousands, when you have that many images to deal with, it's really easy to get stuck on little things, and you got to keep moving. That would be my advice when you are doing culling or editing down your shoot to find the best ones. Keep moving. Okay, so speaking of keeping moving, let's talk about color labels next. Now, I use color labels different than maybe everybody else does, or everybody else uses them different than I do. I don't know. Everybody has their own way of doing things. You can use color labels. There's 5 different colors. They're right here: red, yellow, green, blue, and purple. If you right click on that little square on the right, then you have a menu that you can select which color you want to use. Now, I use these to mark where I am in my workflow and what I think I want to do to the images. So I don't mark colors for images I haven't processed. So after I've gone through and I've started to edit and cull them down, that's when I would apply my color labels. So red means that I need to do basic editing on it in my workflow. Yellow means that I know that I'm going to make that one black and white. Green means that I am going to make that one color and it's edited. And blue means that it's black and white and it's edited. Ta-da! There's my thing. See, you just went to a workshop with me. And purple doesn't actually have a keyboard shortcut. As a matter of fact, I'm glad I thought about that. So these, you can apply them or the color labels with the numbers on the keyboard as well. And that's the number 6, 7, 8, and 9. Now, I've mentioned a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, and there's a good reason for that. And that's because when you work inside of Exposure, especially when you're doing organizing tasks, I find the keyboard is very, very effective. Now, you can also use the keyboard for editing tasks. But before I get ahead of myself, right up here in the Help menu, there are a list of keyboard shortcuts right here, where you can find all of the keyboard shortcuts inside of Exposure. And you can actually set your own keyboard shortcuts in Exposure's preferences. Let's say that you moved over from Lightroom. So I'm going to open up the Preferences panel, and then I can look at shortcuts. Now, right over here, look, if maybe you came over from Lightroom, we have a shortcut compatibility map here so that the Lightroom shortcuts that you're used to using will match up with the ones here in Exposure. Oh yeah, super handy. All right, so why would we want to put all these star ratings and color labels and all of this on our images in Exposure? What we do that for is it makes quick work, or the filters actually, they're at the bottom of this panel. So we've been applying these different settings or to these images, and we can now use them to filter our images out. So if I want to check all of the filter, or I want to filter out all of the images that say have a reject flag. Sorry, didn't come to me there. So I can say I want see all the ones that haven't had a flag applied and all the ones that I've applied a flag to, and therefore I don't see any of the ones that have reject flags. See, so that's paired our images down here. I can also, I'm going to clear this filter. See, take it back out. That's all the images again. I can also do the same thing with our labels, which I only have one in this folder. And we can also do some other things here like sort. So we actually had a recent question about using sort. Is that somebody did some edits on images, but only wanted to export the images that they've edited, not all of the ones in the folder, but just the ones they edited. So they could go right here and go to edit time. Boom. So then all of these have actually been edited, right? So it puts them in order of that, okay? So let's go back to file name. That's the default. So anyway, there are a bunch of options here for sorting and organizing, getting through your images so that you can find the exact ones that you're after fast. So, I also wanted to point out here in the help menu is a place where you can find our manual. And inside of the manual, full written documentation about the product. You can find buttons or descriptions on all of the buttons and all of the sliders and all of the operations that you can do inside of Exposure. So if you ever have any questions, then check out the manual. There's also a link to our tutorials page on our website right here from within the product. So that's nice too. Okay, so we've talked about how we can organize inside of Exposure. Now we need to talk about how we can edit those images. That's the fun stuff. Okay. I'm checking my list here just to make sure that I talk about all the major points because, well, there's a lot of things that you can do inside of Exposure. So far inside of Exposure, we've been using the culling workspace. Okay. The culling workspace is good for when you're doing what we were doing. Well, now we're going to be doing editing. So guess what? Editing workspace. So now all the workspaces inside of Exposure just organize the UI so that it's easier for you to do certain things. For example, if you are client proofing, you really don't want to see all of your editing sliders or anything like that. So I have a workspace that I set up here so we can just look at those images, and that's all we need. So let's go to the editing workspace, which gives us panels for making edits to our images. So I'll double click on that image to make it full size. Okay. Now, before I just start hammering on sliders, I want you guys to take a step back and think about what you're doing. And what I mean by that is adjustments really do two things. When you're editing an image, you really could correct any issues. So that's like one kind of edit that you make would be a correction. And then there'd be like a creative use. So a correction, that's really where you kind of begin doing your editing process. So things like lens correction, right down here, that would be something that I would say start with. Lens correction and exposure uses profiles for lenses that are supported. You can also set this manually if you don't want to use the profile, but the profiles nail it pretty good. So yeah, and you can actually introduce, more or reduce the distortion or vignette or chromatic aberration correction if you have those issues. Now, this is a controlled shoot, so we don't have any chromatic aberration issues, and we have a profile selected here. So I'm just going to leave that. I just wanted to point out that you can turn it manual if you'd like to. Oh, did I show you how to do that? I don't think I did. You can go to manual. There you go. And then you can set up your own distortion correction if you'd like. Okay. You can also turn it off. So these switches show which the panel is on and which panel is off. The arrows right here show that there's been corrections or changes made on this panel. There's a couple of quick ways of when you're working inside of exposure, you can easily see what you're doing to your images. Okay, so we talked about lens correction. There's another thing that we typically do right here on this panel when we think about correcting an image, and that would be adding sharpening. So when I add sharpening to an image, I usually zoom in to a place where I know I'm going to see sharpening artifacts. Now, typically, you zoom in on the face, right? Because you are taking a picture of a person when there's a person in there. However, this was an editorial for a commercial shoot, and so they want to see the stuff in the dress. So that's why I went down to the dress. Now, when you add sharpening and exposure, the way that I do it is I yank the amount up and crank it all the way to the top. And what that does is it enables me to see where the effects from this panel are going to show up in our image. Okay. So I'm going to use another keyboard shortcut as I make some changes here, and that is the Alt button or Option. So I hold that and I drag our slider. It's showing you how wide the radius of our sharpening effect is being applied. Okay. Now, if I crank it all the way to the radius, then if you I got to hold that down. But if you take a look at the larger white spots, you can see that there's a shadow appearing right around the larger white spots. That is the sharpening. That's what it's doing. Now, you don't want to see the dark spots because that means it's going to show really, really strong. So I back that down until the dark spots kind of go away. There still is a little bit of some darkness in there, but for the most part, it's just little white specks. Okay. Now that's because these are like right where all that sharpening is going to happen, or all these little bright highlights here in this dress. So I'm going to hold down Alt and Option again, and then slide the detail slider. Now, if you add a lot of detail in your sharpening, it can pick up on image noise, which can add some texture. And so again, because this is an editorial thing, I think I'm going to reduce that and not have it very strong so that I don't have any texture. I don't want added texture. And then masking, that essentially is telling the algorithm where to select, how much contrast there needs to be in order for the algorithm to select it and apply the sharpening. So I also want that to be kind of moderate, where I'm not sharpening everything and I'm not sharpening nothing. I said that backwards, everything and nothing. So I'm going to back that off so that I am getting some shape around. You can see the little leaf shapes as I change that. I want to have that whole shape there, but that's about it. Okay. Now I'm done with my Alt and Option key. I can let that go. And then I'll take the amount of sharpening back down so that it's more acceptable, where it's like in the right range. That looks good. Cool. Now we have sharpening. So notice we have our little arrow, or our bent arrow circle here saying that you could reset. And if you click right there, it will reset. However, I just spent some time making that happen, so I'm not going to reset it. But if you want to preview the effects, as we zoom into 100%, we can turn those effects off, and then you can see what's happening here in the dress if I turn them back on. So it did do quite a bit of sharpening, and that's where I was saying that I didn't want to overdo it. It would have been very easy to overdo sharpening on this image. Cool. All right. Well, along with sharpening is noise reduction. They kind of come hand in hand. Sometimes when you apply sharpening, you can get some noise, especially when you have higher amounts of sharpening that you add in there. So that would be the next place that I stop, would be noise reduction. Now, exposure's noise reduction is a little bit of a different system. It's built with profiles, and those profiles are built for specific cameras, and they use a bunch of information from that camera. So it has to do with the sensor that's in the camera and then how the camera actually captures the image. So these profiles are actually really, really handy. And they do a great job of getting rid of noise. And so if you do have an image that has a lot of noise in it, then and the profile doesn't capture all of it, then just drag what type of noise that you're seeing, such as if it's more, well, if you're seeing noise that has color in it, then you can add more, I think, sensitivity to the color algorithm, part of the noise reducing algorithm. And same thing, if it's just the light and dark noise that you're seeing, then you can add more luminance noise reduction. Now, the smoothing helps if you have to reduce a bunch of noise. I'm not really seeing much in this image, so this isn't a great, there's not really much you can see on here. But if you drag that smoothing slider up, it actually can help reduce noise and add a little bit of I wrote something down wrong. Sorry about that brief silence. I wrote something down wrong, and that's totally not right. And I started to read it. Anyway, smoothing is another thing that you could add to your noise reduction, and it'll help you. You can also get, if you have some hot pixels, you can turn your hot pixel remover up, and you can add a little bit of texture back in after reducing the noise, because sometimes things can look over smooth after the noise is removed. So you can add some back in with these options at the bottom of the panel. Another thing that we think about when we're doing corrections to an image would be making our transformation adjustments. So if you have a picture of a building, or you want to do some keystoning, right? Like the building looks like it's leaning away from you. Or, yeah, imagine she's a building and she's leaning away from you. Well, a keystone would help fix that so that it doesn't happen. So that's something that you would do when you're thinking about making corrections to the image, right? And so that would be, cropping, things like that. That would kind of be making corrections. So that's where I would begin with your editing process, was those stages that we went through there. Okay. So after doing a couple of corrective edits like that, another corrective edit that you can make, I'm going to put it right here, are the auto adjustments. Now, the auto adjustments are, you can dial them in for your own personal taste. So down here, you can set the strength of all of these different smart adjustments. So if you have, if you want white balance and it's and the white balance correction from the auto adjustment is too strong, then you can just turn that amount down. So usually I have for when I shoot weddings, I usually shoot a little bit dark, because once you have, you want to make sure that you capture all of the details in the dress. So when I know that I'm going to shoot dark. So usually I have my exposure bias up right here so that my images will come out brighter in the end. But I know that, so I have that programmed in. Of course, these aren't my images, so I'm going to turn it back to no. There we go. Anyway, so you can see that it made some intelligent adjustments to the image here. Now, these intelligent adjustments are not going to be the same for all images. This is exposure is actually looking at the image, analyzing it, and then making it an educated guess here. And then you can make adjustments if you didn't like what it did. Now, we have 4 things that we've done to this image in correcting issues, okay? So I'm going to hit escape. Now, remember I said that this was a commercial shoot, so we have a lot of images that have a lot of similarities. So what I can do is take everything that I just did to this one and put it on this one, right? And that's pretty easy. So I just hit previous because this was the one I just edited. And if I wanted to, I could go down to another one that I know I want to keep and do the same thing, right? Or I could select a lot of images and do the same thing. Now, all of the adjustments that we have applied are just those little tweaks that we made on the basic and the sharpening panel. And also it says the lens correction panel, but I didn't do anything there. I just clicked buttons. So anyway, all of those panels or all of the adjustments that we made now belong on all of these images. So we can dial all of those in if we choose to. We can zoom into it and then see if it's, oh, this one's a little bit darker maybe. And so I can go to the basic panel here, raise my exposure up a little bit. It's going to get a little bit brighter. And then I can do whatever I want and then go back. So I began my editing process. Okay. So this is just making corrections, right? So now let's talk about making some creative adjustments or creative editing to our images. Okay. So I'm going to collapse this dock over here and open up the presets panel. Double click so we see it big. Actually, I'm going to open this panel back up because we have all of the stuff that we've done so far on this first layer. And that's kind of what I wanted to mention here. So in exposure, there are tons and tons of great looking presets. And they are, well, you can, I'm trying to think. They're arranged in different folders and you can access them easily with different options at the top. So if I just want black and white images, I can look all through black and white images, or if I want to just use color, I can do that, or just my ones I have marked as favorites. There we go. So inside of them, if you open up one of the folders, you can see a bunch of presets. Now, all of these thumbnails over on the left-hand side, those are showing you what it would look like when it's applied to the image. Okay, so these, what I'm looking in right now, color films, print category. These are great options for things like portraits. And as a matter of fact, let's talk about that. The low contrast category, which have the same presets as the print film category or color films print category. They're the same presets. These are just lower contrast. And that's usually a better option when you're doing things like work on portraits, because it's a little bit lower contrast can make skin look clean and healthy. And then you don't have to go through and do a bunch of retouching. You can just select one of the presets and apply it right to the image. Now, if you notice right there, when I did select that preset, it made the blue square around the preset, and it made some changes on these panels over here on the right side. And we can see all of those are there. Now I'm going to undo what I just did there with Command Z. Okay. Instead of just clicking on the image, you can also apply that in its own layer. So now we have the preset in a layer on the image, and we have all the other adjustments that we made on this layer in the image. Okay. Now, I know that's probably strange as to why I'm doing that, but I wanted to point out some functionality by layering up different looks. Is you don't just need to choose one look in exposure and say that's got to be it. So we can choose another preset that maybe has a little bit of a different look, and I'll put that in its own layer over the top. So now we have a couple of looks that are happening here. And I can adjust the opacity of that and then let that blend with the Kodak Gold preset and give us just a little touch of that flavor, right? So I am getting a little bit ahead of myself when it comes to talking about layers, but what I wanted to show is the functionality of using a bunch of different looks will then create a different look altogether. So a lot of the time I will blend 2 or 3 different looks together on an image just because I think it looks great. And it's easy and fun to mess with the colors. So we look at the presets over here and I applied them to this image. I'm going to delete that layer so that we just have the one preset applied. It's going to be a little bit easier for us to make some other adjustments if we're not thinking about more than one layer. For that matter, I should delete that one. Oops, delete layer. Okay. Okay. So now let me apply a cool preset that I think would work nicely with this image, but it needs to have something that has a little bit more tone to it so we can see that preset. So I'm going to go in here to the aged color films category. Now, aged meaning it is an old photo or it has some deterioration properties to it, like it's been sitting out or, sitting out in the sun. So yeah, there we go. So I want a little bit of yellowing going on in the image, even though we've set our white balance already on the basic panel. Okay. You know what? I actually think this isn't straight and it's kind of irritating me. So I'm going to correct that. Okay. So let's click right here to do my rotate line. Okay, that's better. Okay, let's talk about, okay, we've just used a presets panel. Now we're getting into our editing. So I just did the crop tool here just to move a little bit, make this up on the top of the image a little bit straighter. It was kind of getting me a little bit there. But another thing that we can talk about is the spot heal tool. So we'll zoom in here. We have a little bit of complexion texture, just a tiny bit. So we can click on the spot heal tool. Now, when you use the spot heal tool, I want you to look right up here. The crop and transform panel or layer turns off. So if you have some crop done on the image, it turns that layer off so that when you place all of your retouching stuff, then it will reapply your crop and transform layer. So glad that I pointed that out because some people have said that that's a little weird to their, in their brains, but it makes perfect sense in mine. But I work with developers all day. So all I'm doing here is just finding things that, have a little bit of texture and I just click my button or click my mouse and it will automatically find another target. And you can see you can move that target around. That's what I'm doing here. That sample, I think is the proper term there, sample. Okay. So you can do that, click, click, click one at a time in exposure. If you have little tiny things that you're trying to remedy, right? With the spot heal tool. Now, if you have some other things inside, I'm going to hold down the space bar and my hand, and then the cursor turns into a hand and I can drag around here. So if I was going to use the clone brush rather than the heal brush, heal is more for blemish removal or something like that. Clone is if you're trying to get rid of something and you have a texture. So you can see this texture in the background here. The clone tool would be a better tool to use if you, let's say, are trying to remove something irritating. There we go. And you want it to blend. Now, I'm not saying that that leaf was irritating me. I just wanted to show you that that's what you would use it for. And so that is how you would do that. You use the clone brush tool. Okay. So you got a clone brush tool and a healing brush tool. They both work great. So let's zoom back out here to our image. Neat. Now, we need to talk about what we can do when we're making adjustments, and we need to do that kind of quick. So we went through how we can make adjustments in the basic panel. But I didn't touch on clarity, vibrance, and saturation. It's okay. They're down here at the bottom. I did want to point out that there are shortcut keys for the different things here on this panel. So if you hit F on the keyboard, for example, it will raise the exposure. See how it's going up? Or D will lower the exposure. Okay. Or E and R control the temp. You can see how that's going, right? So again, keyboard shortcuts, you can find that list, bam, right there. And it has all of these different sliders on here, have keyboard shortcuts that you can use to adjust those. And then you don't have to use your mouse. Some people find that a little bit faster, or you don't have to use your mouse as much. Okay, so that's an option too. So I'm going to close the basic panel. Let's talk about color and specifically what we can do with some of the color in exposure. Right now, you can see we've had our preset put on this image, and you can see it says yellowed slightly. So you can actually see right here on this, it has a color filter, this yellow tone right here, that is applied across the whole image, and the density is how strong that is applied. So I can turn that down, which changes that preset, which is fine to customize it. I can also add a little bit more warming or cooling if I wanted to the image. Down below here are the more detailed adjustments. So we have, these are grouped by HSL. So hue, saturation, and luminance controls. Now, these are really awesome. You can grab a hold of specific tones in the image and make changes to those tones with these tools. So let's, like, for example, let's grab the color selector tool over here on the right. And then inside the image here, I'll go to the these pink flowers in the background, and I can grab a hold of that pink. And then if I drag up, then you can see that the sliders for the reds and oranges change in the image. And that's just selecting those pink tones. Now, the pink is very similar to, oh, I let go of my mouse button there, but the pink is very similar to her skin tone. And so it's also pulling that skin tone back into more of a pink tone color. So that's an option right there. We could do our saturation of the tones. And you can do that by dragging one of these sliders. For example, we can make the greens super saturated or no saturation on the greens, right? So if we look back up here on all these leaves, we're actually changing what those guys look like, right? So that's pretty easy to change to make. If we wanted to make them pop a little bit more, add a little bit more saturation to them. You can also do a quick adjustment here, like bring the amount of saturation in the midtones down, which kind of is a cool way of giving a more vintage feel to something. So if you pull that down a little bit, see? Now it looks like it's a little bit more like an older vintagey feel. So that is a cool thing that you can do. You can also change the color luminance, which is nice as well. You don't have to drag each one of the sliders. You can do your own adjustments, or you can use the color picker, just like I did here. That would be, the luminance is the brightness of the tone. So if I want to make, certain tones brighter, I can drag them up, and then the yellows will get brighter, or make them darker, right? So there's a lot of options there. And I mean, you can make huge, huge changes to your image by dialing it in using these tools. Really, really powerful tools here on the color panel. All right, keep moving. Let's talk about the tone curve panel, which is another way of controlling tones on your images. If you use the tone curve editor in Photoshop or whatever software you've used before, then you'll be right at home here. This is what it looks like. You can do all the same stuff, and you can even do a lot more with this. We have a lot of presets here, which are preset tones that you could use, preset curves rather, that you could use. And there are some that are stronger and some that are weaker. Let's see, milky blacks. This is the one that I use quite often. All it is, it's real simple. It has the black point, which is down here on the bottom side of the curve. is just drawn up just ever so slightly. And then there's a little tiny bit of a point that comes straight down off that. Okay. So again, you can move and change anything that you want to here in exposure. And so for example, where I just moved that point, I can take that off there. I just click and add, or click to add one, or drag it directly off of the panel to, or delete it, remove it. Okay. There, that's better. That preset, the Milky Wax preset, was a little too strong for this image, so I just backed that down a touch. There are sliders below here that look similar to some other sliders that you might see. These ones control the tone curve. So if you want to add some contrast to or you want to make the midtones brighter, then you can just add, or just crank the midtones over, and then you can see what happens in the curve, in the dotted line there on the top. So if you ever had some questions about what a adding contrast curve looks like, it looks like this. Or if you want to reduce contrast, that curve looks like that. Anyway, learning lots about curves today. All right. Also on this panel is split toning, which is a way of applying two different tones to two different hues in the image, or hues or values. Usually it's black and white, but there are some color options as well. And this is kind of a subtle effect. Well, I like it when it's really subtle, but you can make them stronger if you'd like to. But essentially what this is showing you, there's the bar in the middle that has the gradient. And what that is saying is that this, right up here on the top, this flag that's blue is pointing to the tone that it's being applied to in the image. So if I drag it all the way to the left, it's applied to the very blackest tones. Or right here, it's on the midtones. So it applies to that midtone and all the tones in the other direction. So bring it down and then apply it in a darker area. Same thing with the yellows on the other side. If I drag that all the way up, it's just on the very whitest white parts. Or if I drag it down in, it will apply across more values in the photo. And each one of these, you can adjust the strength to however you'd like, and you can even make the color differently if you want to make that a little bit. So there's a whole bunch of functionality that you have right here within this to add some cool color looks to your images. Let's keep moving here. Okay. So we have a couple panels that I haven't talked about yet, so let's get to them. The focus panel. The focus panel adds sharpening and or blur to your image, but it's in a creative sense. So we have sharpening here in the sharpening panel, but the sharpening in the sharpening panel is for sharpening images, more like fixing things that are wrong, whereas the focus panel, this type of sharpening is way stronger. Okay, so you can drag like the sharpening amount for, or yeah, you can see how much stronger that sharpening is. So the sharpening on the focus panel is more for creative effects. Okay. Now there's blur here, which will apply blur to the whole image. It's subtle blur, right? But there's another thing that we can use for blur, and that's the bokeh panel. So the bokeh panel has its own controls here for controlling blur on your image. Creative blur. So this thing in the middle that I'm using right here, this is called the focus region. And the center of it, the one with the solid line, that is where the effect is off. The dotted line is where the effect of the blur, which we haven't applied yet because I didn't drag the slider. There we go. There, you can see it. Sorry about that. The dotted line is where the blur is at 100%. So the amount is 22. And so at this dotted line, that's 22 blurs, right? And at this solid line, there's no blurs. And it fades between the two. So that fade is nice and subtle. And so it really appears as if it happened in the camera, and it's a natural occurring phenomena. Like that. Now I closed the bokeh tab, and then it turned that crop and transform layer back on again, if you caught that. Right. So when I was applying the blurring effects with bokeh, excuse me, it was off, but then I applied them and then it came back on. Same thing when we were doing the spot heal before. All right. So we've talked a whole lot about different things that we can do inside of exposure. One thing that we didn't touch on is adding film grain. Exposure is awesome about adding film grain. So I want to point that out real quick. Tons and tons of functionality inside of this grain panel in exposure, including a whole bunch of really nice grain select or presets that we can select from. Okay. So yeah, grain is just grain. I know. But in exposure, you can see that grain, especially because we bokeh'd out over here, now we can see this nice, beautiful, clumpy grain. And we have some more control over where that appears and how it appears in the image. For example, we can turn the amount of grain that is appearing in the midtones, right? In through here, down. But I still want to have that amount of texture from the grain to appear in the dark tones, right? So I can do it like that. And then if I find some highlight areas that have some nice grain on them, I can make that a little stronger. Sometimes the highlight areas and shadow areas will behave differently when you apply grain effects to them. So I like to vary it up. It makes it blend a lot nicer. Now you also can add some more roughness to the grain or variation to its color, or you can add push processing, which does both add roughness, color variation, and will actually add a little bit of contrast too. That's a trick that in the darkroom with chemicals. That's where that came from. Cool. So we've added some really nice looking grain to our image in exposure. That's awesome. All right. Now let's take a look here at our layers panel. See, so far we've added all of our, that's the mask. We've added all of our effects on this one layer. If we hover over the thumbnail, it actually shows us all of the things that we've done on this layer, a whole lot of things. Right. So another place that it shows us what we've done is in the history panel. So we can look back through all of the different adjustments that we've made to our images here in the history panel. Now, it's cool because you can step backward through your editing. Let's say you didn't like the bokeh effect that you put, so that you can just say, I didn't want it. And there you go. You can go back to the preview or previous in the workflow to adding that bokeh effect. And then you could, select that and work in a different way if you want, or you can leave it all there. That's what I'll do. Now, where is all this information saved? Remember when we were talking earlier, where we were talking earlier about our catalog system and how exposure doesn't use one. All of everything that we've done to these images have been saved in our sidecar files. So here's fashion. That's the folder that we're in right now. You can see here, all the sidecar files are saved right there. So all of the edits that we made, all of the history, everything is saved there. And so if I want to, let's say, share this folder with somebody else or work on it from a different computer or whatever, and you have Dropbox, you can just save, just drag this whole folder up in there. And I don't want to do that because I didn't mean to. Oh, I just moved it. Darn it. All right. Well, that didn't work exactly like I was hoping it was, but it happens. So now I got to find my folder panel again. Here we go. See, I didn't lose anything. I just accidentally didn't click. But anyway, so yeah, you can move that folder like that and share. And then anybody, if you did that, anyone that has that Dropbox folder, let me bring that thing back up here. Anyone that has that Dropbox folder will be able to access your images and see all your edits and have all your organization and everything. So it's a really nice and handy way of organizing your images. Now, we have not talked about about exporting our images. So we have been working on raw files, right? And it's a raw file. So we haven't actually applied the edits that we've made to this raw file. That information is saved in the sidecar file. Exposure doesn't actually touch the raw file, right? So what we want to do now is get this image looking this way out of exposure, and we would do that by exporting. So I can open up the export dialog here. And inside of this panel, there are a whole bunch of different options that I have listed out. And over here on the right, excuse me, it tells you where or what those options are. So I have it set to save to my desktop. And then I have it, I'm going to name it. Now, you might remember this from when we were importing our files or when we were getting them off of the camera card at the beginning, when we were ingesting them. This, now we're exporting them. We're doing the same kind of process. We set where we want them to go, what we want them to be named, what kind of files we want it to be, file settings, what kind of file, JPEG or TIFF or whatever you want. And then you can set even, oh, here's some metadata things. Even if you want to include metadata such as a watermark, the watermark there, I don't want one though. And then the image size, how big the image is going to be when you export it. You set all of those options up and you hit export, okay? But I want you to think about this export as a recipe. All of these options that we have here, where it goes, what it's named, the file settings, et cetera, okay? Now I hit cancel. Now there's a quicker way to export in exposure, and that's using quick export, okay? So let's open up that panel. Okay, now remember when I talked about recipes? That's what we're looking at here. It's in a little bit of a different format, but it's the same thing. We have where the image is going to be saved, how we're going to name it, what file settings we're using, what metadata information, and the size of the image. And we have all that saved right here. These are called quick export profiles. And so I have one here for sharing on Facebook and one here for Instagram, and I have them both selected. And let's say I want to make a large print as well. So I can select all three of these export options. And then down here at the bottom, you can see it says one selected image exporting 3 images. So what this is going to do is save exactly that. It's going to save all 3 of these different iterations of these images out. And then I have them ready to be posted to Instagram or Facebook. And I have my print ready to go as well. Okay. You did notice that this large print is a TIFF. Anyway, so that's what you do there. And we're exporting our files. So that's it. Quick exporting is a great way to export images and make it super fast and keep the same settings on all of those. So you have consistency between all of your images. So with that said, that concludes our demonstration today. So we can turn our attention over to answering any of your questions. Before I go to do that, I do want to point out a couple of things, or I do want to say a couple of things, and that's that if you would like to get in contact with other exposure users, we encourage you to do that over in our, what just happened? There you go. There it is. In our Facebook users group. Here it is, right here on Facebook. And people here post stuff all the time, great images and things that they've done, and they share information about what they did and how they edited and things like that. I think that's really cool. So yeah, connect with us over there. That'd be great. Another place that you can connect with us is over on the Instagrams. Instagram, use the hashtag #myexposureedit. There are 2 E's in there. Yes. #myexposureedit. There's tons and tons of great content over there. We actually use get in contact with people all the time over here on Instagram because of what they've posted using this hashtag. So that's a great way to get a hold of us and get our eyes on stuff. So, and we love to see the stuff that you've made with our software. So thank you guys all for that. And so with that said, thank you again for your attention today. And we'll hopefully see you in a webinar in the future.